My name is Allison, and if someone had told me that the most humiliating moment of my life would take place at my own father's funeral, I might have laughed. Not because it would have sounded impossible, but because it would have sounded cruel. And no one thinks cruelty finds them in moments already heavy with loss. But it did. It found me. It wrapped itself in the black lace of mourning and sat beside me like an uninvited guest. It whispered into the ears of my family, feeding their smirks, sharpening their judgment. And all I could do was sit there, alone, absorbing the weight of their laughter. From the moment I stepped into that funeral home, I knew. I could feel it, the shift, the scrutiny, the tension thick as smoke. It wasn't just grief in the air. It was something colder, meaner, soaked in years of resentment and disguised behind polite greetings. Every handshake carried a message. Every hug felt like a trap. And every look they threw at me seemed to mock something I hadn't even done. Yet my father was the center of my world, but I was never the center of theirs. That became painfully clear in the way they received me that day. Most of them hadn't spoken to me in years. Some never even acknowledged me after my mother passed. I was the outsider. Not by birth, not by choice, but by silent agreement, by the unspoken verdict that I had never truly belonged. I was tolerated, barely, and only because my father had insisted on keeping me close. There is something peculiar about funerals. They are supposed to be about closure, about love, about saying goodbye. But they can also be arenas for unresolved tension, unspoken rivalries, and deeply buried bitterness. In my family, all of that came to the surface. It didn't just simmer beneath our black clothes. It danced right above the surface, twisted into smirks and whispers, and sideways glances that made me feel 15 awkward, rejected, invisible. It's funny, in a twisted way. You'd think that grief would unite people, make them forget their grievances, draw them closer through the common pain of loss. But grief didn't bring us closer. It pushed them further away from me. Or maybe it just removed the filters they usually wore when Dad was still alive. Maybe it gave them permission to act the way they always wanted to, when he wasn't around to stop them. The worst part wasn't even their laughter. Not really. It was the way they dismissed me, pretended, like I was some passing inconvenience, like I wasn't my father's daughter. They didn't say it outright, but their actions screamed it. They looked through me. They walked past me without a word. They made seating arrangements that excluded me. They talked about family memories like I wasn't part of them as if I was never there. I watched as they huddled in small groups, telling their own versions of who my father was, carefully curating their grief to make it performative. And I stood alone, feeling like a ghost at my own father's memorial. I could feel the invisible walls around me growing thicker with every passing minute. They acted like I didn't exist until they chose to remember that I did, just long enough to laugh at me. I don't remember who started it, or even why, but I remember the sound of it, soft at first, then bolder, like someone had lifted a curtain. A chuckle turned into a snicker, and suddenly, the air was filled with quiet, mocking laughter. I looked around, confused at first, until I realized they were laughing at me. At my clothes, perhaps, at my makeup, at my presence, at the fact that I dared to mourn the man they thought I didn't deserve to grieve. They didn't know the hours I spent by his bedside, the nights I stayed awake, just listening to him breathe, terrified each breath might be his last. They didn't know the final words he whispered to me, the way he held my hand and told me I was his everything. They didn't know any of that, and they didn't care to. All they saw was a girl they didn't like, showing up where they thought she didn't belong. There's a kind of pain that isn't sharp or loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It seeps into your bones. It makes you question your worth, not because you believe them, but because you wonder how people who share your blood could see you with such disgust. It makes you feel like your existence is an inconvenience, like your grief is inappropriate, like your very presence is offensive. And so I sat there, surrounded by the same people who once celebrated my birth, now laughing behind their hands at my sorrow. I sat there while they passed judgment on every part of me they thought I wouldn't notice. I sat there, clutching the only photo of my father I had in my purse, reminding myself that this moment didn't define me. Even though it hurt like hell, the funeral itself was beautiful. At least, that's what everyone said. The flowers were perfect. The music was soft, respectful. The eulogy was delivered by a cousin who had only seen my father a handful of times in the past decade, but who managed to make it all about himself. People cried. Of course, they always do. But it wasn't real, not for most of them. It was performance, ritual, obligation. I watched them all with a kind of numbness, the way someone watches a movie they've seen before. I knew all the lines. I anticipated every fake tear, every dramatic pause. It was so painfully rehearsed. But that's what funerals often are, aren't they? Rehearsed grief for an audience that wants to look like they cared more than they actually did. And me, I was left sitting in the corner of my own history, invisible and unwanted. While people who hadn't known my father like I did stood up and claimed their version of him as the truth. The injustice of it all made my chest ache. But I stayed silent, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew they wouldn't hear me even if I screamed. They thought I was weak. That's the part that stung the most. They thought I had come back out of guilt or desperation, like I was looking for something from them. They thought I had no place there, no role to play, no inheritance to claim. And maybe that's why they laughed, because to them, I was nothing more than a forgotten footnote in my father's life story. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout, to tell them everything they didn't know about the man they thought belonged to them. I wanted to hold up every letter he wrote me, every gift he gave, every moment we shared in private that they would never understand. I wanted to prove them wrong. But instead, I just sat there, letting their laughter echo in my head. There's a strange kind of power in silence, though they mistook it for weakness. But in truth, I was gathering strength. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't. Something that would change everything. Something that my father had prepared for long before he took his last breath. Something none of them could see coming. But that moment wasn't for now. It would come soon enough. For now, I endured. I sat through the tears and the speeches and the forced handshakes. I listened to them rewrite history with their words. I smiled politely at people who had once told me I wasn't really family. I endured it all, quietly, patiently, because I knew something they didn't. I knew what was coming after the funeral, and it was going to turn their laughter into silence. People don't just decide to laugh at someone in the middle of a funeral unless something deeper has been festering for years. That laughter didn't come out of nowhere. It came from old resentments, quiet judgments, and whispered conversations that had taken place in rooms I was never invited into. That moment at my father's funeral when they laughed at me like I was the joke wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the final act in a performance they'd been rehearsing for years. To understand why they laughed at me, you'd have to understand the kind of family I come from. It wasn't the kind of family you see in holiday commercials full of warmth, hugs, and second chances. Ours was colder, more calculating. Relationships weren't built on love or forgiveness, but on appearances, alliances, and silent agreements. Love was conditional. Affection was a reward. Everything came with a cost. And if you didn't play by their rules, you were cast out, quietly, completely, and without explanation. That's what happened to me. My family never outright told me I didn't belong. They didn't need to. Their actions made it clear enough. They didn't hate me for anything I did. They hated me for who I was, or rather, who I refused to become. I didn't want the life they all seemed so desperate to protect. I didn't want to live behind perfect curtains in perfect homes, sipping wine and pretending everything was fine while the rot underneath spread like mold. I didn't want to marry a man from the right family, attend the right parties, or say the right things just to keep up an image. I wanted something real, something honest. That honesty made me dangerous in their eyes. It started small, the way it always does. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations paused when I entered the room. Family vacations were planned without me. At first, I thought it was coincidence. I told myself they were just busy, that they'd forgotten, that I was imagining it. But the truth became undeniable. I had been slowly, deliberately erased. They didn't confront me. They didn't accuse me. They simply excluded me, the most elegant kind of cruelty. No drama. No mess. Just silence. It wasn't until I chose a different path in life that things got worse. While they all followed predictable routes, corporate jobs, gated communities, carefully curated social media profiles, I chose differently. I moved away. I pursued what they called unrealistic dreams. I made choices that didn't involve money or status or networking. I dated who I wanted. I spoke my mind. I asked uncomfortable questions at dinner tables. I broke their unspoken rules. And in doing so, I made myself a target. But I wasn't always the outsider. There was a time, long ago, when I was still allowed to belong, or at least to appear like I did. Back then, my father was my shield. He saw me for who I really was. He didn't try to fix me or fit me into the mold the others followed so rigidly. He let me be wild. He let me question. He let me make mistakes. And because he loved me openly, the rest of the family had no choice but to tolerate me for a while. What they didn't know was how deeply he loved me. They assumed I was his burden, the rebellious daughter he couldn't control. But they didn't see the late-night phone calls, the handwritten letters, the quiet conversations we had when no one else was listening. They didn't know that I was the one he trusted with his truth, his fears, his regrets, his quiet disappointments in the very people now laughing at me. He kept those parts of himself hidden from them, but with me, he was honest, and they hated that. They hated that I knew a version of him they didn't. They hated that I had his ear, his trust, his protection. They hated that he never judged me the way they did. It wasn't just that I was different. It was that I reminded them of everything they couldn't control, everything they'd given up to fit in. I was the version of themselves they'd buried, the freedom they'd sacrificed, the truth they chose to avoid, so they turned me into a villain. Over the years, they created a narrative around me that made it easier to justify their cruelty. I was ungrateful. I was selfish. I was dramatic. I was irresponsible. I was the black sheep who didn't appreciate the life she was given. Every choice I made was twisted into a flaw. Every failure was evidence that I was doomed. Every success was ignored or questioned. They decided I was a disappointment, and, once they made that decision, they never looked back. Even my father's efforts to include me became ammunition for their judgment. If he paid for something, it was favoritism. If he visited me, it was indulgence. If he defended me, it was weakness. They resented every gesture of love he extended toward me because it reminded them that they were not the center of his world. He loved them, yes, but not the way he loved me. Not with the same softness, the same quiet pride. And that truth, more than anything, made them cruel. The years leading up to the funeral only widened the gap. I became more distant, not by choice, but by necessity. There's only so much rejection a person can absorb before they begin to protect themselves. I stopped showing up. I stopped trying to belong. I stopped giving explanations for my absence. I learned to find family in people who actually saw me, who valued honesty over performance. I learned how to grieve the living because that's what it felt like, losing them long before they were gone. But even as I kept my distance, I never stopped being my father's daughter. That connection remained. We kept in touch. We spoke when it mattered. He never gave up on me. And though I wasn't there for every birthday or holiday, I was there when it counted. I was there when he was sick. I was there when the doctors gave him news he didn't want to hear. I was there when he was scared and tired and didn't want to put on a brave face for the others. I was there when it mattered, not for show, not for credit, but because I loved him. They didn't know any of that. Or maybe they did, and it only made them angrier. Either way, when I walked into that funeral, they saw only what they wanted to see: a failure, a stranger, a girl who didn't deserve to be there. They saw an outsider crashing their event, daring to grieve a man they believed I had abandoned. They didn't ask questions. They didn't consider what they didn't know. They judged, quickly and loudly, as they always had. And so they laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was there. In the way they looked at each other. In the way they rolled their eyes. In the way they shared knowing glances when I sat down. It was in their smirks, in their whispers, in their refusal to speak to me, like I mattered. It was a collective joke, one where I was the punchline, and they didn't care that I could hear it. In fact, I think that was the point. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel unworthy. They wanted me to know, without words, that I didn't belong, that I was a mistake. That I was nothing more than an awkward memory they were forced to tolerate one last time. They laughed not just to mock me, but to reassure themselves that their version of the story was still intact, that I was still the girl they had decided to forget. What they didn't realize was how little their laughter meant to me anymore. There was a time, years ago, when that kind of rejection would have destroyed me, when their disapproval would have sent me spiraling, desperate to explain myself, desperate to be understood. But not anymore. Not after everything I'd been through. Not after learning that love is not always found in the places we expect. Their laughter didn't break me. It revealed them, it revealed their fear, their bitterness, their desperation to maintain control over a narrative they no longer owned. It revealed their insecurity, their resentment, their inability to accept the fact that my father and I had a bond they would never understand. It revealed the smallness of their world, one where appearances mattered more than truth, where status mattered more than sincerity, where image mattered more than love. I didn't laugh back. I didn't confront them. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Because the truth was already written. It was waiting in a sealed envelope, locked in a lawyer's drawer, ready to be read aloud to a room full of people who thought they knew everything. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I only needed time. Because the truth always arrives, not always when we want it, but always when it matters most, and soon. The truth would arrive. They laughed because they thought the story was over. They laughed because they believed they had one, that their version of the past would be the only one that mattered. But the past has a way of speaking, even when everyone wants it to stay quiet. And my father, even in death, still had something to say. They thought they had buried the truth with him. They were wrong. Goodbyes are never what we expect them to be. They're rarely poetic or perfectly timed. They're often messy, quiet, prolonged, and unfinished. But sometimes, they carry a clarity so profound that they alter everything that follows. That's what my father's goodbye became for me, not just an end, but a final offering. A whisper of truth sealed with intention. A farewell that mattered more than any of the pain leading up to it. When someone is dying slowly, the world starts to shrink around them. The noise of life softens. The routine concerns that once felt urgent begin to fall away. What's left is something raw, honest. There's no space for performance in those final days. There's only what matters, and for my father, what mattered in the end wasn't the legacy of wealth or social status that everyone else assumed. It wasn't the house, it wasn't the name, it wasn't the traditions or the businesses or the appearances. It was truth, his truth, and the people who had earned the right to hear it. In those final months, my father became someone few people had ever truly known, not because he had changed, but because the version of him that the world accepted had always been a diluted one. The real man, the vulnerable, complicated, and searching man, was someone he had hidden carefully. For his reputation, for the family's expectations, for the role he was expected to play. But in the quietness of knowing time was short, he began to shed that skin. And in its place, he showed me a version of him that he had been saving, perhaps for the only person who could carry it forward without judgment. He didn't say he was proud of me in performative ways. He didn't tell me everything I did was right. That's not the kind of love we had. But he validated my difference. He acknowledged it. He told me that he merely saw mine in ways others never had. And that meant more than any approval could, because for most of my life, I had been forced to defend my choices, to explain why I didn't belong. But he was the one person who never asked for an explanation. He didn't need one. There is something sacred in being seen as you are, especially by someone who had every reason to want you to be something else. My father never tried to change me. That was his gift. He accepted the complexities in me because he recognized them in himself. He may not have lived his life out loud the way I tried to, but he understood the price of being different. And in those final conversations, he gave me what I had always longed for, not validation from the world, but confirmation from the only person who had ever mattered to me. The rest of the family never saw that version of him. They knew him as a provider, a figurehead, a man of tradition and discipline, and he was those things. But he was also deeply introspective. He questioned his past. He wrestled with guilt. He knew where he had fallen short, and he didn't mask that with denial. He carried regret not in loud confessions, but in subtle acknowledgments, quiet truths left hanging in the air for someone willing to catch them. I was that person. Not because I was perfect, but because I was present, not just physically, but emotionally. I didn't need him to be strong all the time. I didn't demand certainty. I let him exist in his complexity. And because of that, he entrusted me with pieces of himself that no one else would have recognized. That's the thing people misunderstand about connection. It's not built in grand gestures or perfect moments. It's built in consistency, in presence, in the willingness to sit in silence with someone, even when there's nothing left to say. That's what our final goodbye became. Not a dramatic ending, but a series of quiet recognitions, a mutual understanding that, despite everything, love had endured. He prepared things carefully. That much I would only come to understand later. He wasn't someone who left things to chance. Even in dying, he had a sense of responsibility, of intention. He knew the storm that would follow his passing. He knew the chaos it would unleash, the unresolved bitterness, the false grief. He had seen it in his own family before, and he didn't want that for me. He didn't want his final act to be one of silence or confusion, so he planned, thoughtfully, with detail. Not just financially but emotionally. He made arrangements. He wrote things down. He recorded messages in ways no one expected. He made sure that when the time came, the truth would speak for itself, clear and undeniable. That, I would later realize, was his real goodbye. It wasn't just in our final hugs or the way he held my hand. It was in what he left behind. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought they knew the whole story. It was his final act of protection, of love, of defiance. A legacy not of money or property, but of clarity. In those last few weeks he spoke of time in strange ways. He talked about how quickly it had moved, how much he wished he'd slowed down. He reflected on choices not with bitterness, but with awareness. He didn't romanticize the past, but he didn't wallow in it either. He accepted what had been and tried to make peace with it. That effort, I believe, was his way of preparing for the end, not with fear, but with purpose. And in those moments, he made it clear that his relationship with me was something he was proud of, not because it fit neatly into the family narrative, but because it didn't. Because it had been tested, stretched, healed. Because it had survived the silences, the misunderstandings, the distance. Because it was real. Messy perhaps, but real. That was the goodbye that mattered, not the funeral, not the eulogy, not the public performance of mourning, but the quiet, intentional preparation of truth. The choice to leave something behind that would speak louder than any tears or tributes ever. He didn't tell me what he had done. He didn't walk me through the details. He trusted that I would understand when the time came. That was the kind of bond we had. Not one built on constant reassurance, but on deep, unspoken faith. And that faith stayed with me, even as I watched the others dismiss me, laugh at me, act as if I didn't matter, because I knew what they didn't. I knew that my father hadn't left this world without making sure the truth would be heard. I knew that he had prepared something that would not just defend me, but reveal them, not with anger or revenge, but with unmistakable clarity. And so, while they mourned the man they thought they knew, I waited. Not for justice, not for vindication, but for the moment when his final goodbye would rise above the noise and speak for itself, because my father, in the end, chose to speak not to them but through them, through the silence that would follow, through the truth they wouldn't be able to twist, through the legacy he had carefully crafted, not in their image, but in his own. And in mine, he didn't just say goodbye. He made sure that goodbye had weight, direction, and meaning. And that would make all the difference. Asterisk, there is a unique silence that descends when legal words begin to dismantle the illusions people have clung to for years. It's not the silence of respect or mourning. It's the silence of disorientation. Of people beginning to realize they no longer control the narrative. That silence arrived the moment the will was read out loud. It didn't come with an announcement, or a warning. It arrived like a slow, creeping shadow ear, owning the certainty everyone else had carried into the room. The reading of a will is supposed to be procedural. Cold, even. A necessary formality following loss. It's treated as paperwork, as the distribution of things, as a checklist of assets and beneficiaries. But for some people, it is far more than that. For people like my family, it is a moment of reckoning. Because for them, legacy has always been about control, about power, about what you leave behind, not just in objects, but in hierarchy. And they thought they already knew how that hierarchy would unfold. They had spent years positioning themselves. Years of phone calls, visits, curated loyalty, years of pretending they hadn't judged him, hadn't used him, hadn't pushed him toward expectations he no longer wanted to fulfill. They believed that if they upheld the family image, he would reward them. They convinced themselves that, the closer they appeared to him, the greater their share would be. They mistook proximity for importance. And they were wrong. Because proximity doesn't always mean presence. They were present for holidays, and photographs and performances. But they weren't present for the quiet parts. The hard parts, the honest parts. They didn't sit in the dark with him when he asked questions no one could answer. They didn't bear witness to the conflict inside him, the regret, the weariness. They didn't see him when the mask came off. I did. They expected the will to reflect their version of the story. The version where I was distant, irresponsible, undeserving. They thought I had been cut out long ago. They were certain of it, in the smug, unspoken way that people are when they believe their version of the truth is the only one that matters. They weren't prepared for what he had really written. They weren't prepared to be exposed, not by accusation, but by omission. When the reading began, they assumed it would be confirmation of their status, of their influence, of their role in his life. But as the words unfolded neutrally, unemotionally, irreversibly, they began to understand that they had never truly known him, that what they thought was theirs by default had never really been promised at all, that they had been clinging to a fantasy, and the truth had already been written down long before they ever suspected. The will was not a rebuke. It wasn't cruel or petty. That was what made it so devastating. It was simple, clear, and in its clarity, it became the loudest truth they had ever heard. Because it didn't have to justify itself. It didn't have to explain. It simply stated, without drama, what he had decided. And that decision unraveled every lie they had told themselves about who mattered to him and why. He had left instructions not just for the division of things, but for the preservation of truth. He had named names. He had explained, not with bitterness, but with conviction, how he wished his life's work to be remembered. He had given weight to memories they had tried to erase. He had validated experiences they had dismissed. And in doing so, he had pulled me out of the margins they had pushed me into 4 years. They didn't understand how it had happened. They couldn't comprehend how I had ended up central in a narrative they had tried so hard to exclude me from. They didn't know about the documents he had written in his own hand. They didn't know about the letters, the recordings, the moments of clarity in which he made it clear that love could not be silenced by disapproval or rewritten by assumption. They didn't know because they never asked. They had been so sure of their own version of him that they never imagined he had been quietly preparing another. The will didn't punish them. That was the part that unsettled them most. It simply reflected the truth of his heart. And that was worse than punishment. Because it wasn't anger they heard in those words. It was disappointment. Subtle, unmistakable, irreversible disappointment. It was the echo of all the chances he had given them to really see him and all the ways they had chosen not to. They hadn't expected my name to be mentioned. They hadn't expected anything to be left to me. They hadn't expected acknowledgments, instructions, gratitude, or legacy, but it was all there. Not just a portion of his estate, but a portion of his voice, of his memory, of his intention. He hadn't just written me into his will. He had written me into his story, and that was something they couldn't undo. Their laughter didn't just stop. It evaporated. Because the will didn't just give me something they realized it had taken something from them. Not material, necessarily, but something far more painful. The illusion of being the chosen ones. The image of being closest to him. The assumption that his legacy would reinforce their version of events. All of it, undone with a few quiet, deliberate words. And I knew. I knew what it meant before they did. I had felt it, long before the reading, in the way my father looked at me during our last conversations. In the way he spoke, not with pride in their accomplishments, but with a longing for something they had refused to give him: honesty, connection, humanity, not performance, not legacy, but love that didn't come with conditions. He hadn't chosen me because I was perfect. He had chosen me because I had shown up not in grand gestures, but in truth. I hadn't asked for anything. I hadn't expected anything. I had only been there. Fully, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And that, in the end, was what he valued. Not the perfect pictures or the elegant lies, but the one person who saw him, stayed with him, and didn't flinch. The will reflected not just the past, but the person he became in his final years. A man who had grown tired of illusion. A man who had lost faith in the cold machinery of appearances. A man who had finally chosen to be known, even if only by one person. A man who had the courage, in the end, to give everything that mattered to the one person who had never asked for it. They wouldn't admit it, of course. They wouldn't say what they were really feeling, but I saw it in their eyes. The confusion, the humiliation, the dawning realization that everything they had built their identity on, status, inheritance, favoritism, had been quietly dismantled by the man they thought they had understood. And there was no performance that could fix it now. No gathering, no whisper, no rewriting. The truth was written, stamped, final. That truth didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel seen. For the first time, I felt like the years of silence, the rejection, the exile known of it had been in vain. Because in the end, my father had chosen to tell the story that only he and I knew. He had chosen to preserve what was real, not what was expected. That will was his final act of love, and it was the one act they could never laugh at, dismiss, or control. Asterisk, 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 there are moments in life that do not roar, do not crash, do not explode, and yet, they change everything. They are moments that begin in silence and end in understanding. Moments that do not ask for recognition but command it. The reading of the will had already dropped its quiet weight into the center of everything, and from that center, the balance of power shifted slowly. Then suddenly, in an instant, the tables turned. What had once been my isolation became their discomfort. What had once been their confidence turned into confusion. They had entered that space with the certainty of ownership of the story, the reputation, the future, but they left with questions they could not answer. They had not anticipated that truth could outlive denial. They had not prepared for the version of events that no longer protected them. They had not imagined that the man they had claimed would choose differently, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The transformation was not loud, it was not theatrical. It was internal, invisible, but undeniable. It happened in expressions that froze mid-smirk, in glances that no longer met my eyes, in hands that once gestured confidently, now folding in restless silence. The performance had ended, and no one was ready for the reality that remained. They could no longer pretend that I was irrelevant. They could no longer lean on the narrative that had sustained their judgment. They could no longer erase me. Because now, the proof of my presence had been signed, sealed, delivered. Not in memory, not in emotion, but in ink, in law, in legacy. Their silence spoke louder than anything else could. It spoke of disbelief, of wounded pride, of plans interrupted. It spoke of the sudden realization that they had misread not just me, but the man whose love they believed they had monopolized. It spoke of a shift they had no power to undo. This was no longer about inheritance, it was about identity. Everything. They had built their sense of superiority, their quiet alliance against me. Their belief that I was a failure who had been mercifully excluded, had collapsed. And in its place stood a truth they could neither deny nor dismiss. I had been chosen, not just as a recipient of his possessions, but as a witness to his life. A keeper of his story. That truth became a mirror, and in it, they saw themselves clearly for the first time. The discomfort came not from what I had gained, but from what they had lost. Certainty, control, narrative. They could no longer view themselves as the central characters in his story. They had become background, familiar, expected, but no longer essential. The turning of tables is not always revenge. Sometimes it is revelation. It is the moment when hidden truths rise to the surface and demand to be acknowledged. It is not about power over others but power within the self, the quiet reclamation of worth after years of erasure. That was what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, not smugness. Just peace. A deep, undeniable sense that the years of silence had not been wasted, that being unseen had not meant I was unloved, that distance had not meant absence. Everything they had used against me, the choices, the independence, the refusal to conform had once made me a target of their judgment, but now, those very things had become the foundation of my strength. I had not followed their path. I had not built my life around performance. I had chosen authenticity, even when it cost me belonging. And in the end, that choice had been seen, valued, honored. Their attempts to rewrite history had failed. Their assumption that they could define my worth by their standards had crumbled, because the one person whose opinion mattered most had left behind a version of the story that couldn't be edited. A version in which I was not a footnote, but a pillar. What they didn't realize was that I hadn't needed the validation. I had already made peace with being misunderstood. I had already accepted that their acceptance would never come without conditions I refused to meet. I had stopped asking to be included long before my father died. The will didn't give me a place. It simply acknowledged the place I had always held, whether they liked it or not. That was what unsettled them most. Not that I had been included, but that I had never needed their approval to belong. They had spent years believing they held the keys to the family, that love, value, identity, flowed through their standards. But my father had chosen differently. He had stepped outside the structure they had so carefully guarded. He had given his truth to someone they considered disposable. And now, I was no longer disposable. I was unavoidable. They tried to recover, to reinterpret, to minimize. They looked for explanations that would restore their dignity. They whispered theories, invented loopholes, speculated about influence and manipulation. But none of it changed the facts. No speculation could undo the simple reality that they had been wrong about him. About me, about what mattered in the end. In the days that followed, I noticed the shift. Where there had once been laughter, there was now restraint. Where there had been avoidance, there was now uncertainty. Where there had been dismissal, there was now calculation. They no longer looked through me, they looked at me, and not because they wanted to, because they had to. I was now part of the narrative they couldn't escape. But I didn't owe them anger. I didn't owe them explanations. The tables had turned, but I didn't need to flip them over. The truth had already done the work. It had dismantled the illusion. It had spoken in my place. And I let it. Because that was what my father had intended. Not for me to fight, but to stand. Silently, steadily, confidently. The power. They had once held the power to define, to exclude, to judge, had dissolved. And in its place, I held something far more enduring, the truth, not just his truth, but my own. And that truth didn't demand recognition. It simply existed. Fully, proudly, unapologetically. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to be accepted by those who had once laughed at my grief. I didn't need to convince them of anything. Because my worth had never come from their approval. My belonging had never depended on their rules. My story had always been mine to carry. And now, finally, it had been heard. The table had turned. Not because I forced it, but because the truth has gravity. It cannot be suppressed forever. It waits, patiently. And when it arrives, it doesn't need permission. It simply takes its place. And so did I *****. Some moments mark a clean break between who you were and who you are now. They do not arrive with ceremony. They are not always loud. But once they happen, nothing is ever the same again. After the will was read, and the balance of silence shifted, the truth was no longer something I carried alone. It had finally spoken for itself. The weight of invisibility that I had grown used to so familiar, it felt like skin had fallen away. In its place was a stillness, not empty, but full. Full of something I had waited a long time to feel, peace. The days that followed were not about confrontation, they were not about correcting perceptions or demanding apologies. What I did next was not guided by vengeance or pride, but by clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you stop waiting to be understood and instead begin to understand yourself on your own terms. That was the power I walked away with, not the money, not the validation, but the freedom to define the end of the story for myself. There were offers, some subtle, some disguised as civility. Reaching hands that hadn't reached for me in years. Invitations that came with hesitation, guilt disguised as grace. But I didn't take them. Not because I was cruel, but because I finally understood something I never had before. I didn't need to rebuild bridges that led nowhere. I didn't need to sit at tables where I had always been the subject of whispered judgment. I didn't need to revisit rooms I had been forced to leave in order to grow. For years, I had carried the burden of wanting them to see me, wanting them to know the full story, wanting to be believed, and in chasing that, I had poured myself into the hollow spaces of their silence, trying to make enough noise to be heard. But now, I didn't need to be heard by them. Because the one voice that mattered, the one I had lost, had already spoken for me in the most undeniable way. What I did next was simple. I moved forward without looking back. I didn't fight them for control over the story. I didn't argue over memories or defend the relationship they never understood. I let them live in their discomfort, in their confusion, in the aftermath of the truth they tried to rewrite, because that was no longer mine to fix. I had spent enough years trying to be the daughter they could accept. Now, I was simply the daughter my father loved, and that was enough. I took the things he left me, not as trophies or tools of power, but as pieces of legacy, as reminders that being different had never meant being wrong. As proof that sometimes, being on the outside doesn't mean you're not at the center of something real. I sorted through those items slowly, not rushing the process. Each letter, each photo, each piece of his life placed in my hands was another thread tied back to a man who had lived quietly, but loved fiercely. What I did next was build, not something grand or public, but something lasting. I built peace in the spaces where chaos once lived. I rebuilt my sense of family, not through blood, but through honesty. I created rituals for remembering him, small, personal, sacred. I stopped trying to correct the narrative they told about me, because I realized that those who need to distort your story will never accept the real version, no matter how carefully you tell it. I allowed grief to change me, but I didn't let it harden me. That was perhaps the greatest act of defiance. To still choose softness after being cast out. To still believe in truth after being mocked for it. To still walk with dignity, not because others gave it to me, but because I reclaimed it for myself. I didn't seek revenge or recognition. I sought restoration. And I found it in silence, in time, in truth that didn't need to shout to be powerful. The legacy my father left me was not just in assets or final words, it was in the example of quiet conviction. In the courage it takes to be fully yourself in a world that constantly demands performance. In the wisdom of knowing when to speak, and when to let truth speak for itself. What I did next was carry that legacy forward, not to prove anything, but to live in a way that honored everything we had shared that no one else could see. I chose not to remain in the space of bitterness. I did not hold on to what they thought of me, because it was never really about me to begin with. It was about the roles they had been taught to play, the control they had been conditioned to seek, the discomfort they felt toward anything that did not reflect them. I let that go. With intention. With grace. With the understanding that forgiveness is not about erasing what happened, but choosing not to be held hostage by it. I didn't need them to change. I didn't wait for them to rewrite their opinions. I didn't measure my healing by their remorse. I measured it by my own peace. I measured it by my ability to walk away from the ashes of what had been burned and not look back. What I did next was live. Not for them, not in reaction to them, but fully, and only, for myself. There is a quiet power in choosing to keep going without needing applause. There is a strength in building something beautiful out of something painful. There is a kind of freedom that comes only when you stop explaining yourself and start simply being. That's what I chose. That was my next chapter. Not revenge, not vindication, but peace. Not because I won, but because I stopped playing their game altogether, and that, in the end, is what changed everything.